Banker leaves vault key to test the cleaning lady, and her reaction shocked him. Margaret Johnson never imagined that a simple golden key would completely change her life. For 15 years working as a cleaner at Prosperity Bank in Denver, she knew every corner of that imposing downtown building like the back of her hand. It was on a rainy Tuesday in March that she found that gleaming key on the mahogany desk of the bank's president, Richard Anderson. Next to it, a handwritten note that made her heart race. "Prove I can trust you." What a strange situation, Margaret murmured to herself, examining the key carefully. She knew exactly what that key opened. All those years cleaning the bank, she had seen Richard use that same key to open the main vault in the basement, a vault that held the institution's most precious reserves. Margaret picked up the key and held it under the light of the crystal lamp. The golden metal glimmered between her work-worn fingers. For a moment, she thought about returning it immediately to the front desk or handing it over to Jeffrey, the general manager who always treated her with respect. But something about the note intrigued her. "Prove I can trust you." What kind of proof was this? A test of honesty? A trap? Margaret felt a tightness in her chest as she realized her actions might determine whether she kept her job. Without overthinking it, she slipped the key into the pocket of her blue uniform and continued her cleaning routine. She dusted the golden picture frames on Richard's desk, straightened the scattered papers, and emptied the trash. The whole time, the weight of the key in her pocket felt like lead. As she wiped the office windows, Margaret noticed something she had never seen before: a small camera hidden behind an old painting on the wall. Her blood ran cold. She looked around more carefully and spotted 2 more cameras disguised among the decorations. "So that's it," she whispered. "He's watching me." The discovery of the cameras confirmed her suspicions. This was definitely a test. Richard wanted to see how she would react to finding the key. Margaret felt a mix of indignation and sadness. After 15 years of dedicated work, why would he doubt her honesty? She finished cleaning the office mechanically, her mind racing. Downstairs, she wiped the service counters and straightened the chairs in the waiting area. The whole time, the key burned in her pocket. At the end of her shift, Margaret went home to her small apartment in Parkview, carrying the weight of her conscience with her. She lived there with her 17-year-old daughter, Emily, a bright girl who dreamed of studying medicine. "Mom, you seem off today," Emily observed during dinner. "Did something happen at work?" "No, sweetheart, just a tough day," Margaret replied, pushing the beans around her plate absent-mindedly. That night, Margaret stayed up late, staring at the key on her nightstand. What did Richard expect her to do? Return it immediately to prove her honesty? Or was there something deeper to this test? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the bank with the key still in her possession. She had made a decision during her sleepless night. If Richard wanted to test her, she would show him that true trust isn't built with traps but with time and mutual respect. She had barely started cleaning the first floor when she heard firm footsteps coming up the marble staircase. Richard Anderson appeared at the top of the stairs, his face scowling and his eyes flashing with anger. "Margaret," his voice echoed through the empty lobby. "I need to talk to you, now." She dropped the mop and followed him to his office, feeling the gaze of the few employees who had already arrived. Richard slammed the door shut and turned to her, his fists clenched. "Where is the key?" he asked bluntly. "What key, Mr. Richard?" Margaret pretended not to understand, though she knew exactly what he was talking about. "Don't play dumb, Margaret. The key to the main vault that was on my desk yesterday. You took it and didn't return it. This is theft." The words hit Margaret like slaps. 15 years of honest work being questioned like that. She took a deep breath, trying to control the anger rising in her chest. "Theft?" she repeated, her voice trembling with indignation. "Do you really think I'd steal anything from this bank after all these years?" "The facts speak for themselves." Richard banged his fist on the desk. "You found the key, didn't return it, and now you're pretending you don't know anything. I'm very disappointed, Margaret. I'm considering firing you." "Firing me?" Margaret felt her legs weaken. That job was all she had. It paid for Emily's education and put food on the table. It was in that tense moment that the door opened, and Jeffrey Williams, the general manager, walked into the office. He was a 55-year-old man with graying hair and a natural kindness in his eyes that always reassured the staff. "Sorry to interrupt," Jeffrey said, sensing the tension in the air. "I heard raised voices and—" "Jeffrey, glad you're here," Richard turned to him. "I'm dealing with a case of theft. Margaret took the key to the main vault and refuses to return it." Jeffrey looked surprised at Margaret, then at Richard. He had known that cleaner for years and would never doubt her character. "Mr. Richard, there must be some misunderstanding," Jeffrey said calmly. "Margaret has worked here for 15 years. We've never had a single complaint about her. Not even a pencil went missing when she was on duty." "I know that, Jeffrey, but the facts are clear." Richard wouldn't budge. Margaret took a deep breath and decided it was time to tell the truth. She pulled the key from her pocket and placed it on the desk, watching Richard's surprised expression. "Here's your key, Mr. Richard," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "I kept it because I recognized your test, and I decided to show that real trust isn't built with traps and suspicions, but with time and mutual respect." Richard fell silent, processing her words. "All these years," Margaret continued, "you've never had reason to doubt me. But yesterday you decided to test me like I was a stranger. If you wanted me to return the key right away, why didn't you leave it with clear instructions? Why this game?" Jeffrey watched the scene with growing interest. He was starting to understand what had happened. "Margaret is right," the manager said. "If it was an honesty test, she passed. She could have used the key, pretended she never saw it, or lied now. But she returned it and was honest about her reasons." Richard sank heavily into his leather chair, the golden key gleaming on the desk between them. For the first time, he seemed to truly reflect on his actions. He began, but Margaret interrupted him. "May I ask you something, Mr. Richard?" she said, her voice firm but respectful. "Why did you feel the need to test me? What did I do to deserve this distrust?" The question caught Richard off guard. He looked at Margaret, really seeing her for the first time in years. He saw a 45-year-old woman, her brown hair tied in a bun, intelligent eyes, and hands that told the story of a life of hard work. I received some concerning information about employees," he said hesitantly, "and I decided to conduct a general trust test." "A general test?" Jeffrey was shocked. "How many other employees have you tested this way?" Richard's silence spoke volumes. Margaret immediately realized she had been the only one tested like this. "I see," she said, her voice heavy with deep sadness. "You only tested the cleaning lady. You didn't test the managers, the tellers, the analysts. Just the woman who cleans the bathrooms and empties the trash." Margaret's words echoed through the office like a slap to Richard's face. Jeffrey lowered his head, visibly uncomfortable with the situation. "Margaret, Richard tried to explain, but she interrupted him. "No need to explain, Mr. Richard, I understand perfectly." She stood up from her chair. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to prove my honesty once again. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Margaret headed for the door, but Richard called after her. "Wait." He stood as well. You said you recognized the test. What do you mean?" She turned slowly, a bitter smile on her lips. "Mr. Richard, I have a degree in business administration from Colorado State University. I specialized in financial management. All these years cleaning your office, I've observed your strategies, your methods, your management techniques. A trust test as obvious as this one, well, it wasn't hard to spot. The revelation hit the office like a bomb." Jeffrey's eyes widened and Richard was left speechless. "You have a degree in business administration?" Jeffrey was the first to recover from the shock. "Yes," Margaret replied simply. "I graduated in 2003 with honors, but I never got a job in the field. Every time I made it to interviews, something changed. Companies always found excuses not to hire me. So I took this cleaning job to support my daughter." Richard sat back down, the weight of the revelation hitting him hard. For 15 years, he'd had a qualified administrator cleaning his office, and he'd never noticed. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked, genuinely confused. "You never asked," Margaret answered, with devastating simplicity. To you, I was always just the cleaning lady, someone invisible who keeps the place clean. Geoffrey stepped closer to Margaret, his face full of remorse. Margaret, I didn't know. If I'd known you had this background, what would have changed, Mr. Geoffrey? She asked without bitterness, just a resigned sadness. Would you have given me a chance? Or would you have thought a cleaning lady couldn't be a good administrator? The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Richard nervously shuffled some papers on his desk, avoiding Margaret's gaze. Besides, she continued, all these years, going through documents thrown in the trash, cleaning up after meetings, organizing papers left on desks, well, a person learns a lot about how a bank really operates. There was something in Margaret's tone that made Richard look up sharply. What do you mean by that? He asked, a note of concern in his voice. Margaret hesitated for a moment as if deciding how far she should go. Mr. Richard, I've cleaned this bank for 15 years. I see discarded documents, overhear conversations, notice transactions, and some of the things I've seen, well, they didn't seem entirely proper. The silence that followed was deafening. Geoffrey and Richard exchanged nervous glances. What kind of irregularities? Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Unrecorded overnight transfers that never make it to the reports on your desk, loan documents with signatures that don't match the originals, phantom accounts that appear and disappear from the statements. Margaret spoke with the precision of someone who truly understood banking administration. Richard turned pale. If Margaret had noticed these irregularities, it meant they really existed, and if she had spotted them, others might have too. Margaret, he said, his voice trembling, these are very serious accusations. Do you have proof of what you're saying? I didn't look for proof, Mr. Richard. It wasn't my job. I just cleaned and observed. She paused. But if you want, I can show you where I used to find those documents. Geoffrey stepped closer to Richard, whispering something in his ear. Richard shook his head nervously and looked at Margaret with an expression that mixed fear and calculation. Margaret, he said, forcing a smile, I think we can come to an agreement. You're clearly a smart and observant woman. How about we forget this misunderstanding about the key and talk about a better opportunity for you here at the bank? The sudden shift in Richard's behavior didn't escape Margaret. She had touched on something important, something he wanted to hide. What kind of opportunity? She asked cautiously. Well, with your background in administration, you could certainly take on a more suitable position. How about a role in human resources? With a much better salary, of course. Margaret studied Richard carefully. She recognized that kind of maneuver. He was trying to buy her off, offering something good to ensure her silence about the irregularities she'd mentioned. And in return? She asked directly. In return for what? Richard pretended not to understand. Mr. Richard? With all due respect, I wasn't born yesterday. You're offering me a sudden promotion right after I mentioned irregularities at the bank. In return for what? Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Geoffrey watched the scene with growing unease. Well, naturally, I'd expect you to be discreet about these observations you've made. After all, a loyal employee doesn't spread rumors about the company they work for. Rumors? Margaret repeated, her voice hardening in a way that startled both men. I didn't talk about rumors, Mr. Richard. I talked about real documents I saw with my own eyes. Margaret, you have to understand. Richard stood, moving closer to her. An accusation like this could destroy the bank's reputation. It could cause panic among clients, make people lose their jobs, lead to huge losses. Do you really want that? It was a clear attempt at intimidation, disguised as an emotional appeal. Margaret recognized the tactic immediately. What I want, Mr. Richard, is to be treated with dignity and respect. Nothing more, nothing less. And you will be, Richard rushed to say. That's why I'm offering this promotion. You deserve recognition for your talent and dedication. Margaret looked at Geoffrey, who remained silent, clearly torn between loyalty to his boss and awareness of what was happening. Mr. Geoffrey, she said, what do you think about this situation? Geoffrey cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. Margaret, think Mr. Richard is being generous by offering this opportunity." "Generous?" Margaret smiled sadly. 15 years of flawless work, and generosity only appears when I mention irregularities I've observed. What an interesting coincidence. The tension in the office was palpable. Richard realized Margaret wouldn't be easily manipulated or intimidated. "Margaret, let's be direct," he said, dropping the pretense of courtesy. "Do you want this promotion or not? It's a unique opportunity, but I need your word that these observations, you won't leave this office." Margaret held his gaze for a long moment. She thought of Emily, of her needs, of her daughter's dream to study medicine. A promotion would mean a better life for both of them. But at what cost? "Mr. Richard," she finally said, "I accept the promotion, but not because you're buying me off. I accept because I deserve an opportunity after 15 years proving my worth every day." Richard sighed in relief. "Great. Then it's settled. Jeffrey, arrange the paperwork to transfer Margaret to HR. And Margaret, thank you for being understanding." "Just one more thing," Margaret said before leaving. "About the irregularities I mentioned, I won't spread them around, but I also won't pretend they don't exist. If I'm ever officially questioned about them, I'll tell the truth." With those words, she left the office, leaving Richard and Jeffrey in silence. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. In the days that followed, Margaret began adjusting to her new role in the Human Resources Department. It felt strange to be on the other side, sitting at a desk, wearing business attire instead of a janitor's uniform. But something weighed heavily on her conscience. During her first week in the new position, Margaret gained access to files and documents that confirmed her suspicions about the irregularities. As an administrator, she could now fully grasp what was happening, and it was worse than she'd imagined. Suspicious transfers were being made regularly, always after business hours. Loans were approved for shell companies, and the money vanished into offshore accounts. Someone was using the bank for large-scale money laundering. Margaret knew she should do something, but she also understood the risks. She'd gotten the promotion under questionable circumstances, and exposing the irregularities might make her look like a disgruntled employee trying to harm the company. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, everything changed again. Margaret was organizing employee files when she heard a familiar voice at the reception desk. Her blood ran cold as she recognized that arrogant, petulant tone. "I want to speak to my husband immediately." "No, I don't have an appointment. I'm the wife of the bank's president." Margaret slowly stood and walked to her office door. Through the glass, she saw a blonde woman, elegantly dressed, gesturing impatiently at the receptionist. Even after more than 20 years, she'd recognize that face anywhere. Patricia Anderson, née Patricia Thompson, her old college classmate. Memories flooded back like an avalanche. Patricia had always been the most popular in their class, the daughter of a wealthy family, used to getting whatever she wanted. Margaret, meanwhile, was the hard-working scholarship student who worked days and studied nights to keep her grades up. Their rivalry had started over grades. Margaret consistently ranked at the top of the class, while Patricia struggled to pass. But what truly destroyed any chance of friendship was the incident at the end of their final year. Margaret had been accused of stealing a valuable piece of jewelry from Patricia's purse during a college party. The accusation became a scandal that ruined her reputation at the university, and consequently, her chances of landing a good job after graduation. Now, 22 years later, she discovered Patricia was the wife of the man who had humiliated her with that trust test. The irony was too bitter to be a coincidence. Patricia swept past reception and headed straight for the elevator without noticing Margaret. But Margaret watched her closely, taking in every detail. The designer handbag, the expensive shoes, the air of superiority she'd never lost. Half an hour later, Patricia came back down, this time accompanied by Richard. They spoke in hushed tones, but Margaret caught a few words. New employee. Problems. Discreet. When Patricia approached the exit door, her eyes met Margaret's through the glass wall of the office. The recognition was mutual and instant. Patricia stopped in the middle of the hallway, her face visibly paling. For a moment, the two women stared at each other through the glass, separated by years of resentment and misunderstandings. Then Patricia looked away and quickly left the bank. That night, Margaret came home visibly upset. Emily, who was studying for her college entrance exams, immediately noticed her mother's state. "Mom, what happened? You look pale." Margaret sat on the couch beside her daughter, feeling the weight of the past resurfacing. "Emily, you remember how I always told you I had some trouble in college, problems that hurt my career?" "I do, but you never gave me the details." Margaret took a deep breath. Maybe it was time to tell her daughter the whole truth. There was a classmate in college, Patricia. She came from a wealthy family and always had everything handed to her. I was a scholarship student, working hard to keep my grades up, and that bothered her. Emily set her books aside and gave her mother her full attention. In our senior year, there was a graduation party. During the party, a very expensive bracelet of Patricia's went missing from her purse. She accused me of stealing it. "But you didn't, right, Mum?" "Of course not, honey, but her word against mine. Well, she had influence, money, an important family, and I was just a poor scholarship student. The accusation spread through the college, even reaching the professors and administrators. My reputation was ruined forever." Emily held her mother's hand, sensing the pain in her words. "And today, I found out she's married to the president of the bank where I work. The man who tested me with that key is the husband of the woman who ruined my life 20 years ago." "What a terrible coincidence," Emily murmured. "I don't believe in coincidences, sweetheart. I think she knew I worked there and influenced her husband somehow. Maybe she even suggested that ridiculous test." Mother and daughter sat in silence for a few minutes, absorbing the complexity of the situation. "Mom, what are you going to do?" Emily finally asked. "I don't know, honey, I really don't." The next morning, Margaret arrived at the bank, determined to stay professional despite the circumstances. But she had barely settled at her desk when Richard appeared at her office door. "Margaret, I need to speak with you," he said, his tone more serious than usual. She followed him to his office, where she found Patricia comfortably seated in one of the leather chairs. The woman watched her with a cold smile as she entered. "Margaret, I'd like you to meet my wife, Patricia," Richard said, obviously pretending not to know about their past. "Actually," Patricia spoke in a sweet voice that fooled no one, "Margaret and I already know each other. We were classmates in college, isn't that right, Margaret?" "That's true," Margaret replied, keeping her voice neutral. "What a small world," Richard exclaimed, clearly feigning surprise. "What an incredible coincidence." Margaret knew immediately this was no coincidence. Patricia had orchestrated this entire situation. "Patricia told me last night that you two studied together," Richard continued, "and she mentioned some unpleasant incidents that happened back in college." "Incidents?" Margaret kept her tone calm, but her eyes flashed. "Well," Patricia sighed dramatically, "I don't like to bring it up, but there was that situation with my bracelet. You remember, don't you, Margaret?" The attack was direct and calculated. Patricia was dredging up the old accusation, clearly trying to undermine Margaret's credibility in front of Richard. "I remember perfectly," Margaret replied, looking Patricia straight in the eye. "I remember being falsely accused of something I didn't do, and I remember the consequences that false accusation had on my life." "False?" Patricia feigned outrage. "Margaret, my bracelet went missing and then turned up in your backpack. How do you explain that?" "The same way I've always explained it," Margaret said firmly. "Someone put it there to frame me." Richard watched the exchange with growing interest. He was beginning to realize there was something far more complex going on here. "Patricia," he said slowly, "you never told me the bracelet was found in Margaret's backpack." For a fraction of a second, Patricia hesitated, as if she had revealed more than she intended. Well, yes, it was found there. That's why the accusation was made." "Interesting." Richard leaned back in his chair. "And who found the bracelet in her backpack?" I don't remember the exact details," Patricia stammered. "It was so long ago." Margaret observed Patricia's hesitation with interest. There was something here that didn't add up. I remember the details, Margaret said calmly. The bracelet was found by you, Patricia. You said you had a hunch and demanded to search my backpack, and conveniently, there it was, right at the bottom, where anyone could have placed it. Are you implying I set you up? Patricia stood up, pretending outrage. I'm not implying anything. Margaret also stood facing her former classmate. I'm stating it clearly. You planted that bracelet in my backpack because you couldn't stand that a poor scholarship student had better grades than you. The silence that followed was tense and heavy. Richard looked from one woman to the other, trying to process the accusations being made. That's a very serious accusation, Margaret, he finally said. Yes, it is, she agreed. Just as serious as the accusation she made against me 20 years ago, an accusation that destroyed my reputation and my career prospects at the time. Patricia stepped closer to Richard, placing a possessive hand on his arm. Richard, darling, are you really going to believe the words of a mere employee over your own wife? The way she said employee dripped with disdain and prejudice. Margaret felt anger rise in her chest, but forced herself to stay calm. Patricia is right, Richard said slowly. It's very hard to believe my wife would do something like that. Margaret nodded, unsurprised by his reaction. I understand, Mr. Richard. It's natural to defend your wife. But I have a question. Why did she bring up this old story now? What's the purpose of dredging up something from 20 years ago? The question caught Patricia off guard. She looked nervously at Richard, clearly without a prepared answer. I just thought Richard should know about the kind of person working here. What kind of person? Margaret pressed. A woman who's worked 15 years without a single complaint. A woman who returned a valuable key she could have used for her own benefit. What kind of person would that be? Richard began to look uncomfortable. Margaret's questions made sense. Patricia, he said, why did you really bring this up? Margaret has been an exemplary employee here. Exemplary employee? Patricia laughed bitterly. Richard, you don't understand. This woman has always been envious, always wanted what wasn't hers. And now she's here working at your bank with access to confidential information. Confidential information, Margaret repeated. What confidential information? Patricia realized she had said too much. She glanced nervously at Richard, who also looked confused. I mean, general banking information. Patricia, Richard stood up. What specific information are you talking about? None, she hurried to say. I'm just concerned about the bank's security, dear, but the damage was done. Margaret and Richard realized Patricia knew something specific, something that worried her enough to try to discredit Margaret. Mr. Richard, Margaret said calmly, may I make a suggestion? How about we check my employee records? 15 years of work history, not a single complaint, not one unexcused absence, not a single issue. And then compare that to an accusation from 20 years ago, never proven, made by someone who clearly had personal reasons to harm me. Richard nodded slowly. Margaret's logic was irrefutable. Patricia, he said, looking at his wife with a different expression, I think you'd better go home. I need to think about all this. Richard, Patricia protested, you can't believe her over me. I'm not believing anyone yet, he replied firmly, but I need to look at the facts calmly. Patricia glanced between them, realizing she was losing control of the situation. With a hateful look at Margaret, she grabbed her purse and left the office, slamming the door. Richard and Margaret sat in silence for a few moments after she left. Margaret, he finally said, this situation is complicated. Yes, it is, she agreed. But now you understand why I said trust is built over time. Your wife only knows the bad side of a story from 20 years ago. You know 15 years of my work here. Which version is more reliable? Richard sank heavily into his chair, running his hands through his hair. You're right. Your record here is impeccable. And now I understand why you reacted that way to the key test. You'd been unfairly accused before. Exactly, and when someone's been through that once, they develop a special sensitivity to similar situations. Margaret, I owe you an apology, both for the test and for, well, for not recognizing your worth all these years." She nodded, accepting the apology, but something still weighed on her mind. "Mr. Richard, may I make an observation? Your wife seemed very concerned about the confidential information I might have access to. That makes me think she knows about the irregularities I mentioned earlier." Richard turned pale again. "What do you mean?" "I mean, perhaps these irregularities aren't the work of lower-level employees. Maybe they come from much higher up in the hierarchy." The implication was clear and devastating. Richard looked at Margaret with a mix of shock and dawning understanding. "Are you suggesting Patricia—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Richard. Just observing that she showed specific knowledge about confidential information and particular concern about my access to it." Richard was silent for a long time, processing all the implications of their conversation. "Margaret," he finally said, "I need to ask you a favor. Could you show me exactly what kind of irregularities you've observed, with specific details?" She studied him carefully. It was clear Richard was beginning to suspect his own wife, and it terrified him. "I can, Mr. Richard, but I need your word. There will be no retaliation no matter what we find. You have my word," he said solemnly. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers so much. Now, continuing. In the days that followed, Margaret worked discreetly with Richard to map out all the irregularities she'd observed over the years. With her knowledge of bank administration and access to the files, she managed to piece together a troubling picture of misappropriations and manipulations. The evidence pointed to a sophisticated money laundering scheme that had been operating for at least 5 years, and all the clues led to one person, Charles Miller, the bank's chief accountant and, as they discovered, Patricia's cousin. "This can't be a coincidence," Richard murmured, analyzing the documents spread across his desk. "Charles was hired 5 years ago, directly recommended by Patricia, and the irregularities began right around that time." Margaret nodded gravely. It was painful to see Richard uncovering the truth about his own family, but it was necessary. "There's one more thing, Mr. Richard," she said hesitantly. "Yesterday, while organizing the old files, I found records of your wife's personal financial transactions. Transactions far beyond what would be possible with her declared income." Richard closed his eyes, as if feeling physical pain. "How much?" he asked quietly. "Over the last 3 years, more than $2 million in irregular deposits." The number hit him like a hammer. $2 million was an impossible amount to explain with any legal activity Patricia could have been involved in. "What do I do now, Margaret?" he asked, his voice filled with despair. "How do I confront my own wife about this?" Margaret felt genuine compassion for him. Regardless of his flaws, Richard was suffering the pain of discovering that the person he trusted most had betrayed him. "First, we need absolute certainty about the accusations. Second, we need to protect the bank and its clients. And third, well, that's a personal decision only you can make." That night, Richard arrived home determined to confront Patricia, but she wasn't there. She'd left a note saying she'd traveled to visit family in Chicago and would return in a few days. Patricia's sudden absence only confirmed his suspicions. Richard called Margaret. "She's run away," he said, his voice bitter. "Left a note saying she went to visit family, but I called her mother. Patricia isn't there. Mr. Richard, you need to act fast. If she's truly involved and realized we found out, she might be trying to erase evidence or transfer the money to inaccessible accounts. What do you suggest? Freeze all accounts linked to her, immediately, and Charles's accounts too. I can do that for the bank accounts, but the personal ones... For the personal accounts, you'll need legal help. But to protect the bank, freeze everything under our jurisdiction." Richard followed Margaret's advice, and they spent the night working to identify and freeze all suspicious transactions. It was grueling and distressing work, but necessary. The next day, Charles Miller arrived at work and immediately sensed something was wrong. His attempts to access certain accounts were blocked, and he noticed Margaret's unusual presence in Richard's office. Around midday, Charles knocked on the president's office door. "Richard, I need to talk to you," he said, trying to sound casual. "I'm having some technical issues with the system. Some accounts seem to be blocked." "Come in, Charles," Richard replied, his voice tense. I think we can clarify these technical issues. Charles entered and stopped abruptly when he saw Margaret seated at the table, surrounded by documents and bank statements. His face visibly paled. What's going on here?" he stammered. "We're conducting an internal audit," Richard answered calmly, "and we've found some irregularities." Charles glanced at the documents on the table, trying to gauge how much they'd uncovered. Irregularities? What kind of irregularities? Margaret stood up and walked toward him, holding a specific bank statement. Unauthorized nighttime transfers, loans to companies that don't exist, transactions in phantom accounts. She paused. "Would you like me to continue, Charles?" The accountant's face drained of all color. He looked desperately at Richard, searching for some sign that he could escape the situation. "Richard, you can't believe this. This cleaning lady," Charles exploded. "She's clearly trying to frame me to get ahead at the bank." "Cleaning lady?" Margaret repeated calmly. "Charles, I have a business degree from CSU, and I currently hold a position in this bank's human resources department. Besides, I don't need to frame anyone. The numbers speak for themselves." Charles realized he'd made a mistake by disrespecting her publicly. Richard watched the scene with growing interest. "Charles," Richard said, "these accusations are very serious. Do you have any explanation for these transactions?" Well, there might be some errors in the records. System glitches, you know how it is." "System glitches that lasted 5 years?" Margaret asked. "Glitches that always benefited the same accounts? What an incredible coincidence." Charles began sweating visibly. He looked around as if searching for an escape route. "Where's Patricia?" he asked suddenly. "Does she know about this witch hunt?" The question confirmed what Richard already suspected. Charles knew about his wife's involvement. "Patricia is traveling," Richard replied coldly, "but I'm sure she'll be very interested to hear all about this when she returns." "Richard, you have to understand." Charles stepped closer, almost pleading. "I only did what I was told. I never would have done this alone." "Who told you?" Richard asked, though he already knew the answer. Charles glanced nervously at Margaret, as if hesitating to speak in front of her. "You can talk," Richard said. "Margaret already knows everything." It was Patricia," Charles whispered. "She said you were having financial trouble, that you needed extra money. She said it was temporary, that you knew all about it." "I never authorized any of this," Richard said firmly. "And I've never had financial problems that justified harming the bank." Charles realized he'd been used as a pawn in Patricia's game. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "She used me," he muttered. "She told me you knew that it was authorized." "Charles," Margaret said gently, "did you really believe that millions of dollars in transactions would be authorized verbally, without official documentation?" He hung his head, knowing there was no excuse for his part in the scheme. I was in debt. Personal problems. She offered me a way out, said it was safe, that no one would get hurt." "And how much did you make from it?" Richard asked. $50,000, Charles confessed, a pittance compared to what she made. The amount was laughable compared to the millions that had been stolen. Charles had sold his integrity for a relatively small sum. "What happens now?" Charles asked, his voice defeated. Richard looked at Margaret, seeking guidance. She nodded slightly, encouraging him to make the right decision. "Now, you're going to help us track all the stolen money," Richard said, "and you'll provide all the information we need to recover what was taken." "And if I cooperate?" Charles asked hopefully. "If you cooperate fully, we may be able to minimize the legal consequences. But Charles, your banking career is over, no matter what happens." Charles nodded sadly. He knew he'd lost everything to greed and weakness. Over the next few hours, Charles provided detailed information about the entire scheme. She revealed passwords, access codes, secret accounts, and methods used to launder the money. It was a complex system that Patricia had meticulously planned. "She's very smart," Charles admitted. "She studied every detail, every possible flaw. If it weren't for Margaret noticing the irregularities, we would never have been caught." Margaret felt strange receiving a backhanded compliment from someone who had helped rob the bank where she'd worked for 15 years. The question now is, where's the money? She said pragmatically. Most of it is in offshore accounts, Charles explained. Patricia has the access codes. Without her, it'll be very hard to recover. And where is she? Richard asked. I don't know. She told me if anything went wrong, she'd disappear for a while. Said she had a contingency plan. Richard felt like he'd been punched again. Not only had his wife robbed the bank, but she'd also planned her escape in advance. Is there anything else we need to know? Margaret asked Charles. He hesitated for a moment as if deciding whether to reveal more. There's one thing, he finally said. Patricia mentioned you a few times, Margaret. What? Both Richard and Margaret were surprised. She said you were dangerous, that you knew too much, saw too much. She got very nervous when she heard about your promotion. That's why she brought up that college story, Richard realized. She was trying to convince me to fire Margaret. Exactly. She said if you found out the truth about what happened in college, you'd take her side and get rid of Margaret. Margaret felt a chill in her stomach. Patricia had planned everything carefully, even destroying her reputation to protect the fraud. What truth about college? Richard asked. Charles glanced nervously at Margaret, then at Richard. Patricia confessed to me that she planted the bracelet in Margaret's bag. She was jealous of her grades and wanted to ruin her reputation. Said it was one of the smartest things she'd ever done. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard looked at Margaret with horror and remorse. Margaret, he began, but she cut him off. No need to apologize, Mr. Richard. I always knew the truth. What matters is that it's out now. But your career chances, all those years working as a cleaner when you could have been an administrator. The past is the past, Margaret said with a strength that surprised even herself. What matters is what we do from here on. Charles watched their exchange with growing discomfort. He was realizing the magnitude of the harm he and Patricia had caused, not just to the bank, but to people. Is there anything else you need to tell us? Richard asked Charles. Just one thing. Patricia said, if she was caught, she'd blame you, Richard. Said she had fake documents that would prove you were involved. What kind of documents? Richard asked, alarmed. Fake contracts with your signature, forged emails. She said she was protecting herself in case she needed a scapegoat. The revelation was devastating. Not only had Patricia robbed the bank and fled, but she'd also planned to frame Richard if necessary. Where are these documents? Margaret asked. She kept a copy at home, in her office safe, and another copy in a safe at the bank, disguised as legitimate documents. Richard and Margaret exchanged glances. They needed to find and destroy those fake documents before Patricia could use them. Charles, you're coming with us to those safes, Richard said, and you'll help us identify all the fake documents. Of course, whatever I can do to help, Charles agreed quickly. In the hours that followed, they recovered a box full of forged documents that Patricia had prepared to frame Richard. The sophistication of the operation was both impressive and frightening. She really planned everything, murmured Richard, flipping through the fake papers. Even my downfall was part of her plan. At least now we know the truth, Margaret said, and we have proof that these documents are forged. But we still don't have Patricia, and without her it'll be very hard to recover the money. It was true. Patricia had disappeared with the access codes to the offshore accounts, and without her, millions of dollars would remain out of reach. Mr. Richard, Margaret said thoughtfully, maybe we should think about how to lure Patricia back. How so? She doesn't know we've uncovered everything. Charles can reach out to her, say everything's fine, that the suspicions have been cleared. He can make up an emergency that requires her presence. Richard considered the idea. It was risky, but it might work. What if she gets suspicious? It's a risk we'll have to take. The alternative is accepting the loss of millions of dollars and letting her walk free. After much debate, they decided to try the plan. Charles called Patricia, inventing a story about family troubles that required her immediate presence. To everyone's surprise, she agreed to return the next day. She said she'd be back tomorrow evening, Charles reported after hanging up. But she seemed wary, asked a lot of questions. At least she's coming, said Richard. Now we need to prepare to confront her. That night, Margaret went home exhausted but determined. She told Emily about the latest developments, leaving out only the sordid details. "Mom, are you sure it's safe to confront this woman?" Emily asked, worried. "We have no choice, dear. If we don't, she stays free and rich with the money she stole, and Richard could end up being falsely accused. But what if she has more tricks up her sleeve? That's why we'll be prepared. Richard has already alerted the bank's audit team and taken all legal precautions." The next morning, Margaret arrived at the bank early. She found Richard already in his office, visibly nervous. "How are you feeling?" she asked, betrayed, used, furious. He paused. "And grateful to have you by my side in this. We'll get through this, Mr. Richard. The truth always comes out." Around 6 in the evening, Patricia arrived at the bank. She walked in confidently, wearing an expensive dress and sunglasses, as if returning from vacation rather than fleeing a crime. Charles met her at reception and led her to Richard's office. Margaret was hidden in the next room, watching through the slightly open door. "Darling." Patricia kissed Richard on the cheek, the perfect performance of a loving wife. "Charles said you were worried about me. Is everything all right?" "It is," Richard replied, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about some things related to the bank." "About the bank?" Patricia sat down elegantly. "What kind of things?" "Well, we had an internal audit recently, and we found some discrepancies." Margaret saw Patricia tense for a split second, but she quickly regained her composure. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Unauthorized transfers, fake accounts, embezzlement." Richard paused. "Millions of dollars, Patricia." Now she couldn't completely hide her concern. "That's terrible, darling. Who do you think could have done this?" "Actually," Richard stood up, "I know exactly who did it." His tone changed completely. Patricia realized something was wrong. "Richard, you're scaring me. What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about you, Patricia, and your cousin, Charles, and the last 5 years of systematic theft from this bank." The silence that followed was heavy and tense. Patricia looked at the door, as if considering fleeing, but she knew she was cornered. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, trying to maintain her composure. "No?" Richard opened a folder and spread the documents across the table. "This is all the evidence of your activities. Transfers, offshore accounts, everything documented." Patricia looked at the papers and knew she had been caught, but she still tried one last move. "Richard, someone is trying to frame me. These documents could have been forged." "By whom?" he asked calmly. "By Charles. He's already confessed to everything, including your involvement." The revelation that Charles had confessed was the final blow. Patricia realized there was no more denying or escaping. "Where's the money, Patricia?" Richard asked directly. She looked at him with a mix of defiance and despair. "Why would I tell you that?" "Because maybe we can still resolve this civilly. If you return the money and cooperate, we can discuss the consequences." Patricia laughed bitterly. "Civilly? Richard, do you really think I'd hand over millions of dollars just because you asked nicely? So you admit you stole the money?" "I didn't steal anything." She stood up, the mask of innocence finally slipping. "I took what I deserved. Do you know how many years I spent being just the banker's wife? How many humiliations I swallowed in silence?" "Patricia, that doesn't justify." "Justify to whom? To you? To this hypocritical society?" She gestured violently. "I had the perfect plan. If that damn cleaning lady hadn't interfered..." "Margaret didn't interfere," Richard said firmly. "She did what any honest person would do, noticed irregularities and reported them." "Margaret?" Patricia practically spat the name. "Always the same pretentious Margaret from college, thinking she's better than everyone else." "The difference," said a voice from the door, "is that I never stole from anyone." Patricia turned sharply and saw Margaret entering the office. Her eyes narrowed with hatred. "You," she pointed a finger at Margaret, "you ruined everything." "I didn't ruin anything, Patricia. You ruined yourself when you decided to steal." "Steal?" Patricia laughed hysterically. "You want to talk about stealing? How about we talk about how I had to fabricate an accusation against you in college because I couldn't stand seeing a poor scholarship student get better grades than me?" The confession slipped out before she could stop herself. 20 years of pent-up hatred had exploded. Richard looked at Patricia in shock, then at Margaret. "So it's true," he murmured. "You really planted that bracelet." "Of course I did," Patricia screamed, completely losing control. "And it worked perfectly. Her career was destroyed and she spent the last 20 years scrubbing floors instead of competing with me." "Competing?" Margaret asked calmly. "Patricia, I never competed with you. I just studied and did my work." "Exactly," Patricia pointed at her again. "You made it look so easy. Your high grades made mine seem pathetic. You humiliated me just by existing." "And for that, you destroyed my life?" Margaret asked, her voice still calm but filled with deep sadness. "I did what was necessary to protect my position," Patricia replied, showing no remorse. Richard watched the scene with growing horror. The woman he had married was a stranger to him. "Patricia," he said slowly, "do you hear what you're saying? You destroyed an innocent person's life out of pure envy." "And I'd do it again," she shouted. "People like her don't deserve success. They should stay in their place." "And what would my place be?" Margaret asked softly. "Cleaning floors, serving people above me, not trying to be equal to us." The prejudice and arrogance in Patricia's words were so intense that even Richard stepped back. "My God, Patricia," he murmured. "Who are you?" She turned to him, her eyes blazing with a rage that had been bottled up for years. "I'm someone who won't accept being humiliated, someone who fights for what she wants. And if that means planting a bracelet or embezzling money, then so be it." "You weren't fighting for anything," Margaret said. "You were destroying other people because you couldn't handle your own inadequacies." "Inadequacies?" Patricia laughed bitterly. "I got everything I wanted. I married a rich man, had a comfortable life, and even secured a few extra millions to guarantee my future. And lost it all when your greed gave you away," Richard said sadly. "I lost nothing," Patricia shouted. "The money is safe in accounts you'll never find, and even if they arrest me, I'll walk out rich." "Patricia," Margaret said calmly, "do you want to know the difference between us? I lost everything at 22, but I rebuilt my life with dignity. You were handed everything and destroyed it all out of greed." "Dignity?" Patricia spat. "You spent 20 years cleaning bathrooms. Where's the dignity in that?" "The dignity was in supporting my daughter, honestly, in working 15 years without a single complaint, in returning a key that could have given me access to millions." Margaret paused. "The dignity was in never stealing from anyone." The words hit Patricia like slaps. She looked around, searching for a way out. "Enough of this ridiculous talk," she said, grabbing her purse. "I'm leaving." "No, you're not," Richard said firmly. "The audit has already been notified. The authorities are being informed. You're not going anywhere." "You can't stop me from leaving." Patricia headed for the door. "Actually, I can," said a voice from the entrance. Everyone turned and saw Jeffrey standing at the door, accompanied by 2 bank security officers. "Gentlemen," Jeffrey addressed the officers, "this is the person we mentioned." Patricia realized she was cornered. She looked around desperately, but there was no escape. "This is outrageous," she shouted. "You can't arrest me. I did nothing wrong." "Ma'am," one officer said calmly, "you'll need to come with us for questioning." "I demand to speak to my lawyer," Patricia protested as she was escorted out. "That's your right," the officer replied. "You can call him from the station." When Patricia was taken away, the office fell silent. Richard sat down heavily, as if the full weight of the situation had finally hit him. 20 years, he murmured. "I was married for 20 years to a woman I didn't know." Margaret walked over and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Richard, you couldn't have known. People like Patricia are very good at hiding who they really are. But I should have noticed something. The signs were there." "Sometimes we don't want to see the signs because accepting the truth would be too painful." Jeffrey approached them. "Sorry to interrupt, but we need to discuss next steps. The bank must prepare for the fallout from this situation." Richard nodded, trying to compose himself. "You're right. Margaret, can you help us organize all the documentation for the authorities?" "Of course. I'll prepare a full report of all the irregularities and evidence." In the days that followed, Margaret worked tirelessly to compile all the necessary proof. Her administrative experience and deep knowledge of the bank's operations were crucial in building a solid case. During this period, Charles cooperated fully with the investigations, providing valuable information about the methods used in the fraudulent scheme. His collaboration significantly aided in recovering part of the embezzled funds. Patricia, on the other hand, refused to cooperate. She hired expensive lawyers and denied all accusations, despite the overwhelming evidence against her. 2 weeks after her arrest, Richard received an unexpected call. "Mr. Anderson?" The voice on the other end of the line was hesitant. "My name is Dr. Frank Wilson. I'm Patricia Anderson's attorney." "Yes, I'm listening." "My client would like to propose a deal. She's willing to provide the access codes to the offshore accounts in exchange for special considerations in her sentencing." Richard glanced at Margaret, who was organizing papers on the table beside him. "What kind of consideration?" he asked. "Reduced charges, the possibility of serving her sentence under semi-open conditions, things like that." "Dr. Wilson, I'll need to discuss this with my legal team. Can I call you back?" "Of course. But I'd like to emphasize that this is a time-sensitive offer." After hanging up, Richard turned to Margaret. "What do you think?" "I think we need to recover the client's money. If she's willing to cooperate, maybe we should consider it." "Even after everything she did to you?" Margaret thought for a moment. "Mr. Anderson, my personal grievances can't interfere with what's best for the bank and its clients. If this deal helps us recover the funds, then we should accept it." Richard admired Margaret's maturity and professionalism. Even after being so wronged by Patricia, she could separate personal feelings from the bigger picture. "All right, I'll instruct the lawyers to negotiate with her." The deal was finalized a week later. Patricia provided all the necessary codes and information in exchange for a reduced sentence. Thanks to this, the bank managed to recover over 80% of the embezzled funds. With the situation stabilizing, Richard called Margaret into his office for a talk. "Margaret, I'd like to offer you the position of Chief Compliance Officer at the bank." She looked at him in surprise. "Chief, but Mr. Anderson, you've demonstrated extraordinary integrity, competence, and dedication throughout this crisis. Besides, your knowledge of administration and your ability to spot irregularities are exactly what we need. It's a huge responsibility. And you're ready for it. In fact, you've always been ready. I was just too blind to see it." Margaret accepted the position, knowing it was an opportunity to finally use her education to its fullest. In the following month, she implemented new security and transparency protocols at the bank. She created monitoring systems that made it nearly impossible to repeat the kind of fraud Patricia had committed. But her biggest innovation was the creation of an opportunity program for entry-level employees. People like her, who had potential but had never been given a chance. "We want to identify talent at every level of the organization," she explained during a board meeting. "We can no longer allow qualified people to be overlooked because of bias or lack of opportunity." The program was a success. Several employees were promoted or reassigned to roles better suited to their qualifications. The bank became not only more secure but also fairer and more efficient. Emily, Margaret's daughter, was deeply proud of her mother's achievements. Inspired by her example, she decided to study law with a focus on social justice. "Mom, you taught me that we should never passively accept injustice," she said on the day she received her college acceptance letter. "I want to fight for people's rights, just like you fought for yours." Margaret felt her heart swell with pride. Her struggle hadn't just benefited her, it had also inspired the next generation. 6 months after the crisis began, the bank held a ceremony to celebrate the implementation of the new security protocols. Richard gave a moving speech. "Just a few months ago, we faced a crisis that could have destroyed this institution, but we also discovered we had among us an exceptional person, someone who had been underestimated for years." He looked at Margaret. "Margaret Johnson taught us that the true wealth of an organization isn't in its vaults, but in the integrity and dignity of its people." The audience applauded warmly. Margaret stood up, visibly moved. "When I started working here 15 years ago," she said, "I never imagined I'd one day be in this position. but I've learned that it doesn't matter where we start. What matters is how we respond to the challenges life throws our way." She paused, looking at the crowd. "This bank now stands for something more than profits and numbers. It stands for opportunity, dignity, and the belief that every person deserves a chance to prove their worth." After the ceremony, Margaret returned to her office. The same floor she had cleaned for 15 years. On one wall, she had framed her old janitor's uniform, not as a bad memory, but as a symbol of her journey. That evening, she received an unexpected call. It was from a local reporter interested in telling her story. "Mrs. Johnson, your story is inspiring. So many people could benefit from hearing it." "I don't know if my story is that special," Margaret replied humbly. "A woman who went from janitor to director, who saved a bank from bankruptcy, who proved her innocence after 20 years. If that's not special, I don't know what is." Margaret agreed to the interview, hoping her experience could help others in similar situations. The story aired on local television and made a big impact. She began receiving letters and messages from people who identified with her struggle. One letter in particular touched her deeply. It was from a young woman who worked as a cleaning assistant in an office but had a degree in accounting. "Mrs. Johnson, your story gave me the courage not to give up on my dreams. I'll keep trying. I'll keep believing I deserve a chance." Margaret realized her story had become something bigger than her personal experience. It had become a symbol of resilience and hope. Months later, she was invited to give talks at universities and companies about integrity, perseverance, and recognizing human potential. She always ended her presentations with the same reflection. The true measure of a person isn't in their job title or the money they have. It's in how they treat others and the integrity with which they live their life. The humblest work, when done with dignity, is worth more than all the riches gained dishonestly. Richard, meanwhile, went through a deep personal reflection. The end of his marriage was painful, but also liberating. He realized he had been living a lie for years. "Margaret," he said one day, "you taught me something very important. You taught me to see people for who they really are, not the labels society puts on them." "And what did you learn?" she asked. "I learned that I misjudged so many people in my life. I learned that prejudice blinds us to extraordinary talent. And I learned it's never too late to change." Inspired by this realization, Richard implemented significant changes in his other businesses, creating opportunity programs similar to what Margaret had developed. The key test, which had started as a petty suspicion, became a powerful metaphor for the entire organization. The key no longer represented a test of honesty, but rather the key to unlocking human potential. At a board meeting months later, Richard made an observation that perfectly summarized the transformation they had undergone. "We discovered that true wealth isn't locked away in vaults. It's in the people who work with us, just waiting for an opportunity to shine." Margaret smiled as she heard those words. She had begun that journey as a janitor unfairly tested, but now she knew she had become much more than a director. She had become an agent of change. During a conversation with Emily the following evening, her daughter made a profound observation. "Mum, do you think Patricia did you an unintentional favor?" "How so, sweetheart?" "Well, if she hadn't robbed the bank, you never would have had the chance to prove your competence. And if she hadn't confessed about the bracelet, your reputation would never have been cleared." Margaret considered her daughter's words. It was an interesting perspective. "Maybe you're right, Em. Sometimes the worst situations lead to the best outcomes. And now, what are your plans for the future?" Margaret looked out the window of her apartment, the same apartment she had lived in for years as a janitor, but which now held a completely different meaning. "I want to keep making a difference. I want to ensure others don't go through what I did. I want to create a world where merit is recognized, no matter one's background or social standing. That's an ambitious goal. The best goals always are, sweetheart." End of story. And now, dear listeners, we'd love to hear what you thought of this incredible story of Margaret. Do you think Richard truly learned to value people? Share your thoughts and let us know where you're tuning in from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories like this one. Thanks for joining us.